Hello and welcome to Life or Death for the Murray-Darling. My name is Charlotte Nitschke and I'm the Campaign Coordinator in Water Issues at Conservation SA. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting tonight on the traditional lands, the unceded lands of the Wiradjuri, Woiwurrung and the Boonwurrung Woonwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. They are the traditional owners and the first custodians of these lands, and we really want to pay our deep respects and honour their elders past and present. It is NAIDOC Week, and the theme this year is for our elders. So I want to take a moment to really reflect on that. Aboriginal people have been on these lands for 65,000 years at the very least. They're the oldest living culture on the entire planet, and there's so much that we can learn from them about so many things: sustainability, regeneration, and particularly about managing our waterways. So a really warm welcome to any First Nations folk joining us here tonight. And thank you to the audience. Thank you for participating in this really crucial conversation. Little bit of housekeeping. So you probably have seen the toilets are back outside in the foyer. Now, when we get stuck into things, there'll be a QR code which will come up on screen like that. So if you can scan that code and then submit your questions through to the panel there, that would be great. Or if you can't scan the code, just go to slido.com and type in that number code there. So we've had a great range of questions come through so far, which is fantastic. So thanks to everyone who's done that so far. And you can also vote for your favourite questions. So please get on there and do that and vote for them. Awesome. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our host for tonight, Virginia Trioli. Now, she probably needs no introduction. You'll certainly recognise her voice. She's the host of Mornings on ABC Radio Melbourne and one of Australia's best-known journalists. She's been with ABC local radio since 2001, and she's been gracing our ears ever since. She's a two-time Walkley Award winner, and prior to broadcasting, she spent 9 years in print journalism. So she's been following the plight of the Murray-Darling for many years now, and on and off air, and she's here tonight to help us get to the nitty-gritty of why is the Murray-Darling so important, what's wrong with the river, and how can we fix it. Thanks, Virginia.
Thanks, Charlotte. Good evening, everyone. I'm glad you came out. It's not too cold an evening, so it's a wonderful time and way to spend a Friday night here in Melbourne. So welcome to the Wheeler Centre. And I'd like to also share Charlotte's acknowledgement of the traditional lands on which we're meeting this evening and pay my respects to any elders past, present and emerging here in this room. And to acknowledge the incredible custodianship of Indigenous Australians of these lands and waterways for tens of thousands of years. So we're meeting at a pretty crucial time, and these people to my left, who I'm about to introduce you to, know this better than anyone. Let me just lay out a couple of key landmarks that describe why right now is so important. The next Murray-Darling Ministerial Council meeting is scheduled for August, and that'll be a critical decision-making time for state and national leaders about what the final year of Basin Plan 1 will look like and what Basin Plan 2 could look like. So the meeting takes place amid a confluence of concerning and serious issues. Funding for the Murray-Darling Basin water recovery will end on the 30th of June next year, and there's nothing in the federal budget beyond that point. Budget papers show that the federal government's going to pull the plug on $1.56 billion of unspent funds allocated to recover 450 gigalitres under the Water for the Environment Special Account at the end of 23-24. Funding for New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia to recover another 650 gigs from 36 supply and constraints measures also comes to an end on the 30th of June next year. That's under the Sustainable Diversion Limit Adjustment Measures Program. Anyone keeping up with the acronyms is doing very well. The MDBA is also about to undertake a reconciliation on water recovery towards the Basin Plan targets. And state and federal bureaucrats, I'm sure you're well aware of this, they've already warned it'll lead to a shortfall in water recovery up to 340 gigalitres. We were arguing about this figure before, and I'm happy to go with Mr Beasley's figure here, which is only 4.0 gigalitres of the 450 gigalitres promised under the plan by 2024 has been recovered to date. And 2 months ago, the Productivity Commission released its review of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, the Implementation Review 2023. This is the latest in the Commission's 5-yearly reviews, and it reveals the Basin Plan is well short, surprise, surprise, of achieving its water recovery targets. So, where to from here? No one, from any point of view, whether you're talking about it from the point of view of an irrigator or even from the point of view, of course, from those trying to get decent water back into the river system, no one denies how crucial these issues are for the viable future of the basin in all its uses. But is the plan the right plan, and what should happen next? So let me introduce our terrific panel to you this evening, starting here from your left to my right. Richard Beasley, Senior Counsel at the New South Wales Bar. He was the Senior Counsel assisting the Murray-Darling Basin Royal Commission and is now South Australia's first River Murray Commissioner. He's the author of 5 works of fiction and 1 piece of non-fiction, which is entitled, in a very roundabout and obscure way, Dead in the Water, a very angry book about our greatest environmental catastrophe. It's very hard to know what he's talking about. It was published in 2021. Richard, great to see you here. Good evening.
Thanks. Nice to see you.
Kate McBride. Kate McBride is a 5th-generation grazier from Western New South Wales. She was born and brought up on Tolano Station, which is a 500,000-acre sheep property located along the lower Darling River. And over the past 5 years, Kate's become a familiar face in the fight for a healthy Darling-Barker River and Menindee Lakes, and has been interviewed for a number of programs, most notably Australian Stories Crimea River and ABC's Q&A Drought Special. She's passionate about rural and regional Australia and is dedicated to fixing water management to ensure healthy communities. And Kate's currently working in Canberra as a Parliamentary Liaison Officer. Kate, welcome to you too. Brendan Kennedy Muluwadangi is a Tadi Tadi and Wadi Wadi traditional owner, Deputy Chair of Murray-Darling Rivers Indigenous Nations, Chair of the Victorian Aboriginal Water Officer Network, and a Melbourne Enterprise Principal Fellow in Cultural Economies and Sustainability, amongst many other accolades. He's been instrumental in elevating the profile of First Nations water rights in the Murray-Darling Basin, and he features in a new ABC TV show which is going to air in about an hour's time, so he can bilocate, so we'll be canonising him anytime soon, which is called, what's the name of it again? Remind me?
First Weapons.
First Weapons, which sounds fabulous. So you'll miss it, the first episode this evening, so I look forward to you catching up on ABC iView when you get home tonight. Brendan, great to have you here. Good evening.
Thanks.
And Michael van der Zee is a water policy analyst for the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists. He's had an extensive career as a senior government policy advisor, which includes 15 years' experience in national and state water policy reform. He's now living in the Upper Goulburn Broken catchment area and has a small farm and a vineyard, and describes his time there as his best use ever of water coming out of that whole water system. And he was the inaugural CEO of the Winton Wetlands, which was Victoria's first major water storage catchment. So please welcome Michael as well. Did I get that right, Michael? Okay. All right, so we're just going to start with a few opening statements and thoughts from our panellists. Then I've got some questions here, and I really do urge you to have a look at Slido, to log on, to post your own questions, and also to vote up the questions that you want to hear asked. Don't be shy about that. Get them up high, and then you can ensure that the panel actually gets to consider them and gets the time that it needs to consider them properly. So, Richard, we'll start with you, if you'd just like to say a few words to kick us off.
I'll just say what I think is the biggest problem in relation to the plan, biggest problems. Unsurprisingly, this was a plan, the Murray-Darling Basin plan is a plan to work out how much water needs to go back into the environment out of consumptive uses to stop the degradation of our environment for Australia to fulfil its international treaty obligations under various environmental treaties. Unsurprisingly, the legislation required the plan to be based on, and only based on, the best available science, and it just hasn't been, and all of the governments that have touched it know that, but have gotten away with it because water is so complex, water issues are so complex that they can get away with it. So the Royal Commission I was involved in, which was led by Brett Walker, made as his most fundamental finding that the basin plan's invalid because it was based on a compromise between bureaucrats, lobbyists, politicians, informed to a degree by science, of course, but not based on the best available science, and that there's, as the plan stands now, in this ridiculous equation of 2,750 gigalitres to be recovered each year on an average basis. To give some perspective of that, there's 500 gigs in Sydney Harbour, 2,750 minus 605 plus 450 is the plan. It's really unlikely that that's a science-based plan. I think the other problems with the plan is that the states have gotten away with not recovering the 450, of which you just said about 4 has been recovered, and that's absolutely crucial. And in relation to the 605 as that part of the equation, that's actually water that's never had to be recovered for the environment, but is somehow counted for the environment based on a series of pieces of infrastructure like regulators on a river where mini dams will push out water into a wetland, and then there's an equation made as to whether that's better for trees but not so good for fish, and it might do nothing for birds, and there's some mad equation of that's completely closer to pseudoscience than science. And so what we've been left with is a plan that's recovered about 2,100 gigalitres on a yearly average, perhaps. And whether people have an opinion about whether the basin plan's a good thing or not, I don't care, but I have read the scientific reports, and there's no published peer-reviewed science reports that say a plan that only recovers 2100 gigs will actually achieve the environmental aims of the plan. So it's fundamentally unlawful. It's not recovering enough water for the environment, and there are other aspects of it that are pretty dodgy, and it also didn't factor in any future climate change projections. So all of those things mean it's not in a great place. It is better than nothing, because in times of drought it actually has made some difference to very stressed parts of the environment. So it is better than nothing, but it needs a lot of improvement. And to people that don't think more water should be recovered for the environment, that's a fair enough opinion to have, but for that to be lawful, you'd have to actually, Parliament would need to change the Water Act from a fully science-based plan to something less.
You may want to make... Sorry. I keep thinking I'm mic'd up. You may want to make a few more points, but I just wanted to pause you there on one observation, and you've made your point powerfully about the lack of a scientific base. But when you say the entire plan is fundamentally unlawful, what do you mean?
The core of the plan about the amount of water that on a yearly average has to be recovered for the environment, which was, as you can imagine, when they're drafting the basin plan, there's a heap of scientists involved, ecologists, water experts, hydrologists, and when I say ecologists, fish people, tree people, etc., and ultimately computer modellers. And to get the water to the right parts of the environment and the critical wetlands and what the Water Act calls the environmental assets requires certain flow rates at either certain times of the year or once every 3 years or once every 7 years. And the work that went into that originally said the amount of water that needed to be recovered was 4,000 to 7,000 gigalitres on a yearly average. Now, I've got no problem with people saying that's just too much and it would do too much economic harm to rural Australia, and I'm not going to comment whether they're right or they're not, but the plan was pushed down to what I said was this crazy 2750 minus 605 plus 450 equation, not through science, but through a negotiation between bureaucrats and politicians. And that's just not what the Water Act allows. The Water Act just says the plan is to be based on the best available scientific knowledge, and with all due respect to a negotiation between politicians and bureaucrats about working out what's doable in terms of getting through Parliament, that's not best science, that's negotiation.
So it's the lack of best science that, to your mind, makes it illegal? It's
not to my mind. Brett Walker is arguably Australia's best lawyer, who was the Royal Commissioner. That's his finding. I've never read anything written by anyone that suggests he's wrong about the unlawfulness of the core part of the plan. Now, that means it's vulnerable to a judicial review application. You could probably take proceedings just on the fact that climate change projections weren't included, if you take the assumption that that's part of best available science. Yes. But I'm not a fan of that, because I've been told by people that know I'm a lawyer, not an ecological expert, and the people that do have the expertise tell me that even a crappy basin plan is better than none. So I'd rather not blow it out, but it does need to be improved. It does probably need to be made lawful if we're a country governed by the rule of law.
Kate McBride, some opening reflections from you before we get to the discussion.
Yeah, so I've been asked to give a little bit of a rural perspective look on the basin plan, and that's quite a tough perspective to give. We had Susan Close, who's the South Australian Water Minister, along to our South Australian event, and I sort of jokingly said you're probably going to get more agreement in the Ministerial Council meeting on water than you probably will in rural Australia, because it is quite divisive. I think the best way to put it is that some people have been really happy with the basin plan and others have been devastated. And I think that's quite telling, because when the Chief Executive of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority was up speaking at National Press Club a few months ago, he sort of said that he's doing his job right if everyone's a bit pissed off at him. And I think that's not the case at the moment. Some people have benefited greatly from what's been going on. And other towns, like where I'm from, Menindee, we've seen the devastating impacts of what not recovering enough water looks like. So I'm certainly on the side of it that isn't happy enough. And, you know, I'm a farmer, but I also care about the environment. And that's most of our farmers in Australia. We're often painted with a bit of a bad brush, but the reality is there's no jobs on a dead river. And I think just putting some statistics out there, because often the basin plan is branded as irrigation versus the environment. Yeah. And I really don't think that's very fair. I think it should be over-extraction versus everything else. Because within the basin, we have a tourism industry that's worth $11 billion, and most of that is in regional areas, of course. The Murray-Darling Basin Authority says fishing employs around 10,000 people within the basin. We've got, of course, 40 First Nation groups, if not more, which really rely on the river. I'm from out west, so the Barkinji people are the traditional owners out our way, and they literally get their name from the river, the Barker. So all of these elements rely on a healthy Murray-Darling Basin, but unfortunately it has been pinned as the environment versus everything else, and that's pretty disappointing. The reality is the basin plan was a compromise for everything, including the environment. And as Richard's just said, by not recovering water, we're actually asking the environment to continue to compromise further. And that's not fair on anyone, because it was a deal. And when you try and see people whittle it down even further, which has happened politically as well, a number of other amendments have gone through to reduce our water recovery by another 70 gigalitres from the top of the river as well. It's really problematic, because what we saw at the start was already a compromise. So the basin plan's pretty off track. We know that, and we've seen the language from our federal government change in the last few months from they're going to deliver it on time and in full to now just in full, which is pretty disappointing to see being an election commitment. But just as Richard was sort of touching on before, there is real problems with the basin plan, but that doesn't mean we should blow it up. And I think there's fear in regional communities, because that's what they've been told for a number of years, that the basin plan will destroy your livelihoods. And that's just not the reality if you look at the facts. And just like the basin plan didn't let science get in the way of a good plan, you know, there's people out there that don't want to let truth get in the way of a good yarn. And I think this fear in irrigation communities really stems around something called like buybacks, which is where, you know, people willingly sell their licences back to the government. And it's the quickest and most efficient way to get water back into the basin. And it's going to be really important for delivering it. They've been told that these are going to destroy your communities, but when you actually look at, you know, facts, the Royal Commission, that the South Australian one that Richard was involved in, found that negative impacts of buybacks either don't exist or are greatly overstated. And yet these people have been told for years that they're going to hurt your communities. ABARES came out and said that buybacks might affect the price of water in areas, but seasonal conditions have the biggest impact, and so does the expansion of almonds, probably more so than buybacks. So there's, you know, when you start looking at the facts, they're not there. I think we do need to try and use this as a unifying moment, though, and that's why something we've actually been pushing for recently is, if we're going to have buybacks in the basin plan, let's actually think about the regional communities, because there is fear there, and I think we need to be working with them a lot better than we currently are. So is there a way that we can invest in regional communities while buying back water? Because we know that there's 3 to 4 times as many jobs if we invest in health and education and services than there is if we put infrastructure projects in these communities. So if we actually want what's best for the communities, and God knows our regional communities need some investment in health, then I think that's probably a good way to go about it. And Minister Plibersek has been really good in saying, you know, let's have some different ideas out there. And I think that's an idea that we at the Australia Institute have put forward to all different political parties, because I think this can be a unifying moment, but we just need to let some facts in rather than just propaganda that we've seen for recent years. So I'll leave it there.
Just a quick question before we move on. Is there something inherent or intrinsic to the plan? You were talking there about the argument or the discussion devolving into that bifurcated one against, you know, environmental flows versus irrigators. But is there something in the plan that's actually pitted community against community? And have you seen that play out?
I think what's kind of happened is that big business has made it this environment versus irrigation, because the last thing they want is for everyone else to unify together, because it is an over-extraction problem. And so if we actually look at that, then there's people that are going to lose out there. And I think I think they've done this for a reason. And I think...
That's an important point that she's making.
Yeah, just till later though. Yeah. No, keep talking. Kate.
Yeah, like I think exactly that. Like it's been carefully done to divide us, and it's been done by, I think, governments in certain respects, but all over the place. Yeah, I think that's the problem, and I think we, as a community that rely on a healthy river, the fact is there's no jobs on a dead river. It doesn't matter if you're an irrigator or you're a dry land farmer or a tourism operator. There's no jobs. So let's try and get this fixed, implement the basin plan in full and bloody quickly, because we can't just keep letting our wheels spin.
Kate, thank you. Brendan, what would you like to say to kick us off?
Well, there's no more disadvantage or community in this country that is hurting more than First Nations. So the 44 nations in the I can hear an echo. 44 nations in the basin. I mean, how much hurt do we have to endure before we start to be counted? And the science. Oh my goodness. We're talking. Well, the warnable dates now sit at 120,000 years, so that's double the 60,000 years that everyone's sort of sitting on. So 120,000 years of science. And when I hear they're my trigger words, scientists and experts, my nostrils flare up, because here we are, our science, our cultural science. But first of all, I want to pay respect to my Wurundjeri people, not Wiradjuri, but the Wurundjeri of the Woiwurrung, of the Kulin Nations of Naarm, and their neighbours of the Bunwurrung. So I want to pay respect to them. This is their country, and they have never ceded their sovereignty. And so our water in this country is being colonised like never before, and the colonisation of our water, it's relentless, and I've seen it over my lifetime, but yeah, and our water is being stolen from us as we speak. It's been stolen from our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And it doesn't look as though it's going to stop. And it's theft, and a part of that is there's rotting of the system that's been created. I mean, I won't bring myself to even begin to understand, but I love listening to you talking, by the way. But and my people are like, oh, we don't own that river. This notion that they don't own the river, our people are just starting to hear this, because in their minds, their spirit is connected to that waterway. So, there's still colonisation of our waterways happening. There's the states and the Commonwealth continuing to steal our people's inheritance, our rights to water, even though this country is a signature to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So, there's a lot. We're talking, I thought this was a lucky country, the fair dinkum country, where we get a fair go, but that's not the case for First Nations people, particularly. And in the water space, it's extremely corrupt, and it's a crime against our people.
Is there anything in the existing Murray Basin plan that reflects Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty over the water? Is there any aspect of it that's actually taken account of that?
Chapter 10, Part 14, must have regard.
Regard.
Must or may have regard. Now you can just I can have regard for you. May have regard, so I may have regard for you. How you doing? Nice I have regard for you.
Depending on how you're
see you
feeling
later.
today.
That's it. So anything more than that is improvement. And that's where it's at. And so we've got to crawl across broken glass and minefields of this system to even claw back you know, a seat at the table. We don't own any, we own 0.17 or 0.2% of the water in the Murray-Darling Basin. So 44 nations. 44 nations own 0.2% of the water in the Murray-Darling Basin. So if that's not a crime, I don't know what is.
Brendan, thank you. Michael, what would you like to say to kick us off?
Thank you very much, Virginia. Yeah, first I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional owners of the country we're meeting on today, and also the ones, the traditional owners of the land that I live and work on, the Tangarong, the Wairaroo and the Yorta Yorta. I think it's one of the joys of being last, I suppose. I get to sum up what everyone else says. So for those of you that don't know, the Wentworth Group was formed in the early 2000s by Peter Cullen and a bunch of friends in a certain pub in Sydney. And look, its formation was largely due to concerns at that time about the state of national water reform. And there was a group of scientists that got together and basically started working on trying to get a national water initiative up and going again after its first failed attempt. And so Wentworth Group is very much about bringing good science to policy and decision making. And I'll just pick up Richard's point. I think Wentworth Group's view in this is, and we put this strongly in many of our publications, is that the basin still remains over-allocated. I don't think there's any question about that. How we arrive at eventually the right volume is a moot point. The lack of science, good science in those decisions is a real concern. And look, political compromise is a reality, but let's not hide behind bad science, right? If you need to make a difficult decision, I think it's really important that politicians, we elect them. You know, if they get it wrong, we can unelect them. So they need to be honest about this. And I think one of the things that really concerns me is how much of this is done, these deals are done behind closed doors. They're not transparent. They lack integrity. And look, at the end of the day, it's going to come back and haunt us. If we don't give the system enough water, we're going to have to go and do this again. And God forbid, you know, like I was just saying to Brendan, you know, the Murray-Darling Basin Commission was established 40 years ago, 1983. You know, in response to blue-green algae outbreaks, and 40 years later we're still working on this, and we have a fish kill like we've just had up on the Barker. You know, what's changed? So I think the other part of it is the Murray-Darling Basin is very much the natural environment. It's also the communities that live there, and for this to be successful, it needs to, you know, involve all those communities. I agree with Richard. It's an imperfect plan. Look, that's the nature of the beast. I've had the joys of working on intergovernmental relations in water for 20-odd years. It's a really, really difficult patch, right? And I'd really like to acknowledge the people that work behind the scenes anonymously in government that do that, because most of them are very good-hearted and they're working in the public good. They don't get an opportunity to express their professional views. They're silenced. And as a consequence, I think we miss out on a lot of knowledge and experience that might otherwise be available to us. And I'd like to acknowledge that, because, look, my expertise comes from, you know, what people have had experience come from what people have handed down to me. And the reason I'm here today is, you know, I want to hand that down to other people. I was saying to Brendan, there's not many young people here. This is really complicated. It's taken me 20 years to wrap my head around this. To be able to make at least an impact or talk sensibly about reform. And there are many people in this room who've spent that time as well. They're not being heard. And I think that's a real challenge. And then I suppose picking up on Brendan's point, look, we have an incredible amount of knowledge out there that we need to draw on. And as far as Wentworth Group's concerned, the next plan, it's quite clear. The two key bits that are missing are Aboriginal water rights and adaptation to climate change. And we can't do without either. Right?
Just before I move to a panel discussion, I want to pick up that point, because I did want to ask you about Plan B, because it has unfortunate sort of connotations to it, but the Plan 2, what's the state of that in terms of MINCO? I mean, at least where the various levels of government acknowledge that plan is coming or has to be drawn. What is it and what might it look like?
Well, as you say, plan number 1 was supposed to be delivered by, or is supposed to be delivered by the 30th of June, right? And there is then a review process of that plan, which starts in 2026, or needs to report in 2026. So look, we're how many years down the track? I have real concerns with that. We were sitting down as Wentworth Group members with the Murray-Darling Basin Authority earlier in the week, and we're just saying, you know, where's the capacity to adapt an ARI? You know, you're basically looking, because of SIDLAM, the SIDLAM project's being delayed. The talk is that the reconciliation process that we were talking about is actually going to be pushed back. Right? And as a result of that, well, there's not much point in having a basin plan review, is there, until you've got those things done, because the assumption was always they'd be completed. So the process, as I understand it, is that in order to extend those timelines, they will have to amend the Water Act, and I understand there are discussions to that effect happening at the moment that would allow the timeline and the money and everything else to be extended. It actually requires a change to legislation. And that'll be a very interesting exercise in the Senate, I think, as we look forward. But my understanding is that's due by the end of this year. Right. Otherwise we can't move forward. And then following that, there'd be Basin Plan 2, which would include the incompleted bits of Basin Plan 1, plus, I think most importantly, climate change and Aboriginal water rights. Any Basin Plan 2 that pushes things down the track in terms of these projects has to, be agreed on very, very tight timelines, and there has to be serious consequences if things aren't delivered. Unlike Basin Plan 1, where things have just moved and stretched. And the real concern we have is that this is just going to get kicked down the road again for a little further, because it's all too hard and it's all, whatever, and we'll never see the end of it. And it's time to break that, cycle, I think, however we do it. But bringing everyone else into it, and I think communities is a key part of this. The national government's had a go, states have had a go, irrigation systems have had a go. We're still not there. It's time to bring communities in.
We'll circle back and pick up a few of the points that have been made by our panellists, but I just wanted to get you an opportunity. Did you want to just pick up that point that Kate was making? We'll need your microphone.
Yeah. What Kate was talking about, there's a few things that probably should get teased out. One, Kate was talking about over-extraction. The Basin Plan and the Water Act got kicked off because John Howard gave a speech at the Press Club in January 2007 where he said we're over-extracting our rivers and we need to do something about it because that's causing damage. And you don't need to believe me, but it's a statutory fact in the Water Act that we're over-extracting. It's pretty unusual to have a piece of legislation that actually legislates a fact, but that's legislated in the Basin Plan. What Kate was talking about, irrigator versus environmentalist and buybacks, I think, look, there are people that are dead opposed to the voluntary purchase by the government of water, and some people are genuinely fearful about that and fearful about the Basin Plan. I've spoken to some of those people. They're not making it up. I've had people in tears about the Basin Plan. I think one thing that doesn't get acknowledged that probably should, that whilst the government did need to buy water for the environment, without pointing the finger, when this was originally done a long time ago, it might have been done in a way that wasn't particularly strategic. It frightened a lot of people, and it might have been able to have been done better, and that's left some ongoing resentment that there would be many people, including Kate and perhaps others here, that would be better to speak to that than me. The pure economics of it, though, are that the peer-reviewed economics do show that the impact of buybacks has not been as great as some people have said. But let's assume that mainly because people that sold their water didn't sell an entire entitlement, so they stayed in farming with less water. They spent the money they got locally, so there was a boost to local economies. There's not a proportional relationship between less water and less crop growing. There's a whole range of things that are in the peer-reviewed economics. But let's say that buybacks do harm, and they certainly have harmed some very water-dependent towns, then the government's got to compensate those people. It needs to bring in structural adjustments. Everyone's going to have to get used, despite how much rain there's been recently, everyone will have to get used to, in the Southern Basin, if the climate scientists are right, of a future with less water, with or without a basin plan. And that means Canberra needs to be helping the people that are going to suffer the most from that.
I want to just stay with that and also stay with the focus on communities, because I think it was a really great observation, Michael, about communities are going to have to be brought in and listened to here. Brendan and Kate, can I get you to both reflect on that? And also just a point, please feel free in this discussion to jump in. This is a conversation amongst you and everyone here today, so you don't have to wait till everything's over to be asked to jump in if you've got something that you really need to say. But in your experience, Brendan, have have buybacks been divisive in the community? Have different parts of the community been able to come together in an understanding of what they're about and what they do and how they help the plan?
Well, my people haven't been able to be a part of that. We haven't had the water.
You're up Robinvale way, aren't you?
I'm in Robinvale, the Mid-Murray. So, you know, I can see it. I can see the benefit in it. And I'm sure there are a lot of water holders and irrigators and farmers that are willing to voluntarily sell the water back. So I think, and that has been done. We've had the environmental water, but it just hasn't been delivered. The other thing is, yeah, look, my people haven't had the water to sell water back. Well, it's not in our way of thinking that, you know, the idea of selling and trading water. But just no, the way that it's been mal-administered and it's been treated poorly, the decision-making, the way that our people have been, we've been locked out of the discussion, where we now have a new word we want to get in the tent, or we want to drive the bus. But if we talk about, and there are some moves being made in the water space around First Nations people, and they've set this target of 3% to match the closing the gap. But if we look at New South Wales alone, in New South Wales part of the basin, the Aboriginal population's 9%, and it's on track to hit 18% in the next 20, 25 years. So they're setting. They already know the forecast of our population, how it's going to grow in the basin, and they're setting this target. 3% is a hell of a lot more than 0.2% at the moment. But yeah, we need to be setting our targets for water ownership in the basin to even be a part of.
Yeah, exactly.
The scheme you're talking about.
Kate, what's the buyback experience that you can speak to?
Yeah, it's interesting. My stance on buybacks is one of the most important things is having them voluntary and open tender. This is not the government going in and telling people you have to sell the water. The other thing that I think's been really missed in recent years...
Sorry, just to jump in, and how has it been established so far?
So recently, like the previous government sort of put caps on how many buybacks could be around and then just sort of stopped buying any water. We've had, you know, sort of a decade almost of very, very little water recovery. So that's problematic. So the reality is that farmers should be able to sell their water. They can sell it to their neighbour, they can sell it to someone downstream on the temporary market. Why can't they sell it to the Commonwealth for environmental benefits? That's, I think, the first thing, is that this is voluntary and it should be up to them. In terms of my community's experience with buybacks, we had a rather interesting one where Barnaby Joyce essentially came to town and bought a $78 million, or paid $78 million for a licence that was not worth that much, and then gave Tandau, which was owned by Webster, an extra year of water just because they wanted to grow an extra $25 million worth of cotton. So that's been our community, and that wasn't open tender. And that's really problematic because within buybacks we have seen some dodgy water buybacks, and that's why they do need to be open tender so that we bring some transparency to this.
And how did the community deal? I mean, was that divisive and rancorous within your growing and agrarian community?
No, I think it was just frustration from the community. Because like that's not fair, and that's a lot of money for water that the reality was a lot of that water wasn't getting down to the river anyway, and people have referred to it sort of as ghost water. So it's really problematic.
What do they mean by ghost water?
It just doesn't come down. The water just isn't there. You're not actually going to...
Hang on. No, we're not going to have shouting from the floor, mate. Sorry.
It's really problematic.
It's not a licence to pump out of the river. It's a licence to take water moving across.
Sorry.
And if the water's not there,
but can I just make it? I really don't want to descend into shouting from the audience. You got a question? Whack it up on Slido. Hopefully others will vote it up. I'll try and get to it. We've got a fair bit of time for discussion here, so please let's not do that, okay? Because then it'll devolve down into who's got the loudest voice, and that's been the problem with policy in this country, hasn't it?
Ain't that the truth? Yeah, so I think that's going to be a really interesting one, particularly with the NAC now up and running at a federal level. I think in water policy there's going to be a few referrals when it comes to water, and whether that be buybacks and other things, that there's going to be serious questions that need to be asked.
Yeah, if I can. Yeah, look, I think, you know, as people say, follow the money trail. It's an interesting one, and certainly I think there've been some pretty bad things done over time. What the benefit will be of bringing them to light, we'll see. But if I can just respond to sort of the points Richard raised around buybacks, I think, look, there are some legitimate concerns, and I think Richard made a very good point, the lack of strategy behind it. You know, so in Victoria in particular, you know, the federal government gave Victoria $1 billion to renovate the Goulburn Murray Irrigation District to improve the efficiency of that enormously. But if you then, on top of that, just let everyone sell off, it has some implications for the people in those systems. So I don't know whether people are aware, but they all share the costs. If someone sells their environment, you know, sells all their water to the environment and gets out of there, then the remaining people share the full cost, and so it goes on. And look, you know, something the size of the GMID could probably absorb that. Some of the smaller irrigation systems would have definite issues, and what that means is for those that remain, their costs go up. So it's a legitimate concern. I think there's a real opportunity, getting back to the point I was making about community, is that, you know, there's an opportunity here for doing strategic buybacks at a community level. And look, you know, I was aware of one much earlier days, but there's a community in Victoria, I won't name it, who got together and basically identified the fact that things were changing, and there was a lot of irrigated land out there that wasn't viable, and there were issues with salinity and everything else. That community got together and worked it out for itself, right? And they sold water. Some people sold water out, some people became dryland farmers. Some of it was eventually bought up by a large group who then restored the biodiversity values, consolidated farming and all that sort of stuff. This was done by a local community. It's possible. It's possible. And as far as I'm concerned, yeah, I've heard, you know, it's quite successful. I know the business that did the consolidating recently sold it off, but it was a mechanism for getting things like superannuation funds into this and all sorts of things. So I think there's a real opportunity. I think governments have been a bit lazy about the way they've gone about it. They've created this market, right? And yet they have not regulated it. And when you let people buy and sell it all over the place, and, you know, some of the other issues are, you know, selling it downstream, for example, to almond farms, that's fine. Look, the intention of the market is to sell it to the highest and best use in the interests of economic efficiency. You can agree with that or not. But at the end of the day, if the almond farmers are going to make a hell of a lot more money per megalitre of water than, you know, someone growing potatoes, so be it. Who are we to argue, except there are consequences of taking water from where it is now downriver. You know, we've got a very expensive irrigation scheme that's, you know, having water leaking out of it down to some almond farmers who pay for their own irrigation infrastructure. So look, it's quite a complex issue, and personally I think communities are best placed, I think, to deal with this at an appropriate scale. Sometimes it might be township, sometimes it might be irrigation system, sometimes it might be region, but I don't think we've really given them a go. And look, there are a few examples where it's been quite successful. And we're now at a point where, you know, as Tanya Plibersek said the other day, it's getting really hard and we want to deliver it in full, but we don't know when. Yep. And without it, I don't think it's going to happen.
Richard, I just get the sense you want to make a couple of points there before we move on to... No, okay.
I agree with everything Michael just said.
But just on that point where you were saying about, okay, if the almond growers they can maximise and make a lot more money, then where does it end? If it just keeps going and going where, you know, it's just going to build up. Yeah, okay, the economy is going to increase within the basin.
Well, that's an untethered market, and the whole purpose of this scheme, this plan, is supposed to have some degree of constraints around it.
Yeah, look, if I can just respond to that. I agree with Brendan. Part of the problem is that, you know, for agricultural land, there's fundamentally no planning development controls, right? Other than if you have a major environmental impact and you've got to go through the EIS process. So normally these things are dealt with elsewise through a planning scheme that says, yes, it can be for this use, or no, it can't be. But if it's agriculture, I think we've all got a bit of an issue of trying to tell farmers whether he can grow, you know, potatoes or almonds or whatever else. Fair enough. But I think when you start looking at development on the scale that we're seeing, and it was preceded by the MIS type development too, you've got large scale investment, which is basically loose capital, right? Cheap land, water at a reasonable price, and they figure they can pump the water themselves so they can save themselves all those costs. And then you set it up and sell it on to the next person. And so it goes. So it's more about making money than it is about managing a farm. And look, at this stage, there are no controls that I'm aware of at state or federal level to stop that, rightly or wrongly. You know?
Well, let me get to a couple of questions that are popping up here. I've got plenty of my own, but I think it's a good point at which to bring in these two. And I'll put them together. Anne Thorpe asks, what's the best way to fix the over-allocation of water usage licences? And Peter Fraser asks, and this has come up in a number of different forms via your questions, which are terrific, shouldn't we be restricting the types of industry, agriculture that can call on water from the Murray-Darling? I'm thinking of almonds, which I've mentioned as an example of a very water-hungry crop, and of course cotton has been mentioned in questions that are coming up, and Kate, you alluded to it before. Richard, do you want to kick off there?
I certainly don't think anyone should be able to tell someone that owns a water licence what they should grow.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that, because if I ever talk about this on air, just as we're hearing in the room here, all I'll get on the phone lines is cotton. Stop the cotton growers.
No, I think cotton and rice get a bad rap. They're not crops that have to be grown every year. People grow cotton and rice when they've got water, and if they don't have water, they won't grow the crop. The much bigger problem is the permanent plantings like almonds, and whether you should actually regulate how many of these trees we have, because you've got to get water to them, otherwise the plant dies. So that might be something that needs to be looked at, because it's so out of control.
Wait one second, finished?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, can I just jump in there? I think you're right, Richard. I mean, almonds at the moment, when there's plenty of water out, it's not an issue. But if we find ourselves in a situation like we did with the Millennium Drought, right, we have emergency circumstances, and then there's provisions under the water agreements to basically, prioritise water. One of the things that get quite high priority is these permanent plantings. And that's the time when life's going to get very, very interesting indeed, because we now have so much in the way of permanent plantings, particularly down towards the South Australian border. Our capacity to actually be able to deliver that to those crops is a question, and that's not a responsibility for those farmers. It's the responsibility of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and the water operators to meet that need.
Let me hear from Kate. I'll hear Kate on this.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. It does always come up. Let's just ban cotton or ban this. The reality is the problem is not with the crop. The problem is with the water licence. So if you say, okay, let's ban cotton, that same farmer can go and grow sunflowers, whatever he or she wants. That's the way it sort of works. Now, I do think at some point, because we are seeing a massive explosion, I think it's 900% increase in almond production in the last 20 years within the basin. And every single almond takes between 4 and 12 litres of water to grow. It is massive.
And then there's all the water needed to make the almond milk. But anyway.
Exactly. People think they're doing the right thing. I've got so many mates off of almond milk, it's not even funny. But yeah, so that's a problem. I don't think we can tell people what they should and shouldn't grow, but I do think that this country, the reality is we're facing a future with less water, and we are going to have to make decisions in the future, whether that be the farmer working with government or just us as people, have to decide what we want to grow in this country. And is that, crops that we're just going to export and not actually get food out? Because when we're putting in more almonds, we're seeing, particularly in that Riverland in South Australia and Sunraysia area in this state, we're seeing fruit trees and grapes and other things pulled out, and dairies are really suffering as well. So water is going to the highest value crop. Is that a good thing for the national interest? And when it comes to food security, is that giving us a future?
Did you want to jump in, Brendan?
I live in almond country, and you've never seen a pump before, unless you've seen a pump on the Murray River for almonds. And it's huge.
Describe it for us.
Huge. Well, it's as big as this room, but it's a huge pumping system.
Yeah.
And the structures that they put in, but the amount of water, they grow on the mallee. So they plant them in the mallee, on the sand, so the mallee is sandy, which it absorbs immediately. So I think we should be making decisions about what can and can't be grown.
Is there any discussion of that around within your almond growing community?
Well, I mean, it provides a lot of jobs.
Sure.
And they say, oh, it provides a lot of jobs. But these aren't local people.
Yeah.
These are people who are coming into the area. 80% of the people coming in and taking the jobs aren't the local people.
And we haven't done research on almonds specifically, but often we hear jobs. We can't do this because, it'll cost jobs. Richard, in his book, made a great perception that if we were worried about jobs, we wouldn't have brought in the bloody harvester for cotton, because that used to be people's jobs. we're moving towards a future with that. But we actually looked at, with the Australia Institute, we released a report that looked at cotton grown areas and looked at how reliant they are on, so there's areas like Narrabri and others, how reliant they are on cotton. And so we looked at ginning and also growing. These communities, only about 5% of the community rely on cotton for their jobs. So it's drastically overstated, and we're constantly told this, but that's why we called the report Pulling the Cotton Over Your Eyes, because people are saying that it's going to be diabolical for these communities. There's a lot of other things in regional communities, and we actually need to be focusing on them too.
Michael?
Yeah, look, I think it gets down to some of the very interesting socio-economic data that we either have or don't have in the Murray-Darling Basin, because, I mean, communities need to have those facts in front of them. Right? And as a community, you can decide it is important. Just one point I'd make, and I'm not I'm a sort of farmer, but a very small farmer. But look, it took me a long while as a Victorian working in water to understand cotton and rice. But look, one of my good friends and colleagues is here in the audience, farms rice from time to time. But it became very clear, because for some parts of the Murray-Darling Basin, it's a bit boom and bust. So when there's lots of water, as Richard points out, it's fine to grow rice and cotton because it's an annual crop. Equally, it's one you can turn off when it dries. So as part of a farming system where you might have sheep and you might have wheat and you might have rice, it's quite a sensible thing to do and quite a good adaptation to the varying nature of climate we've got. Quite smart farming. Once you get to the point where these things get that large, though, that they almost require permanent water, and you've got this large monoculture, then the game changes, and of course there's huge amounts of money behind that. And that's, I think, where you get to the sort of distortions that we get here.
I wanted to ask you, we'll go around the panel for this, how do we define successful management of the Murray-Darling? What does that look like? We'll start with you, Richard.
Kate used the word compromise about the Basin Plan. That's what it is. The Basin Plan is not, and the Water Act are not statutory instruments that say we go back to 1788 or we go back to the time when a pump was first put in the Murray. The idea is that we assume irrigated agriculture is going to continue, and we hope it thrives, and you can grow as much of whatever crop you want, provided we stop at the point where we're killing the environment. That sounds really reasonable. It's incredible how much anger even that, what sounds like a reasonable proposition.
But it loops back to your original observation about verifiable science as well, because you would know what that point was if you were accumulating and relying on that verifiable science.
So that's what a good plan looks like. Where it's going to get very tricky is 2050, 2070. If the climate science is right, there'll be towns that run out of water. Adelaide could be one of them. It'll have probably a few desal plants going by then. And really tough decisions will have to be made, not just about what food and fibre can be grown, what towns can be saved, and also there might have to be horrible decisions about what parts of the environment can or can't be saved. But in the end, the plan is meant to be this compromise between getting as much money through the growing of food and fibre in the basin, but not killing the joint.
Yeah. Kate?
Yeah, I think that sort of real focus on science and traditional science as well is what's going to be really important, because that is something that's totally left out. And yeah, tens of thousands of years of knowledge on this. And I think that real, how do we value the environment? And I don't think we can't put a dollar value on what that's worth, and that's really problematic, because I think, you can say tourism's worth $11 billion, but the environment's worth a great deal more. So I think, really incorporating them. I think we've got a lot to learn. We've got a lot of models that, they sort of supposedly say certain things, but the river doesn't listen to models, and we actually need to be listening to the river and what that's telling us. And right now it's telling us that we need to recover more water because it's bloody sick.
Brendan, for you, what does successful management of the Murray-Darling look like?
Well, not having ceased the flow events like up the Barker, and where a cotton station has dams full of water, but there's no water flowing in the river. So that's not the way to do it. The environment has to come first. If you've got a healthy environment, then everyone's going to be healthy. But our people have to be in the driving seat. If we're not holding the steering wheel, we've got to be at least in the car. But we need to be a part of driving it and being the decision makers around water. Cultural flows, cultural water for our people.
Before I go to Michael, there's a question that's been sitting here for a while that I did want to ask you. To what extent are First Nations elders able to participate in the decision-making process?
Oh, we're able. we've survived a brutal onslaught, so we're still here. So we're able, we're strong, and we're willing, and we've got a lot of fight in us. And we've got.
But the question I think more goes
as in being enabled.
Yes, as in being
well, we're not being
included
enabled.
in the process.
No,
Yeah.
we're not. Yeah. No.
The Basin Plan's really tokenistic about Indigenous Australians, so may have regard. The point that Brendan made before.
And it is may.
It is may.
That's a good title for a song, isn't it?
It's,
may have regard.
The techno speak for it would be it's not best practice in terms of Indigenous people's consultation. It's not up to international standards, and that would be, you'd think, easily fixed.
Yeah, can I just jump in there? I mean, you know, there's another bit of the Commonwealth, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and I have had the pleasure at some stage of approving environmental approvals there, and any time I had to think about a decision, I had to have regard. Had to, must. And this goes back to 1993. Right. And if I got that wrong, there was a federal AAT in the federal court to review my decision either on merits or the facts. So, like, it's not that this model doesn't exist. I just think it's very, very poorly done. Yeah, so.
And it's being used as a political football, which is really problematic as well. Like, how many years ago were First Nations people promised $40 million to go to water ownership? And it, 4 or 5 years ago?
5 years ago. We haven't received 1 cent. We were promised 4 years ago. 4.5 years ago.
Yeah, just extraordinary. I mean, it's just repeated lip service.
It's just to keep us out of the water sector.
And to say they're doing something when they're not.
Michael, I might get you to address that question.
Well, having regard.
Yeah, having regard, yes. All got regard this evening. How we define successful management in the Murray-Darling, according to you?
Look, from a scientific point of view, I think we've got to maintain and improve the ecological processes that underpin it, right? Species may come and go, whatever. Once the fundamental ecological processes are under threat, you know, the whole thing can fall apart, and we've really got no ability to bring it back. I think that's a real concern. And that underpins everything that goes on top of it. So it's people's livelihoods, it's agriculture, it's the biodiversity, it's the future of this place, is that if that's not healthy, then, you know, it's going nowhere. The one point I would add to what Richard made earlier on, though, it's not just about the water, right? So let's get back to a little bit of holistic stuff, and you know, we need to look after the catchment as well, because one of the reasons the water isn't great is the water quality isn't great because some of the land management practices aren't great, and that's been forgotten in all of this. It's the just add water approach, I think, is a problem. I think I'm not saying you could replace water with better land management practices, but I think they have to go hand in hand.
Richard, jump in, but then I want to hear from Kate on land management as well. Yeah.
Part of what Michael was talking about, maintaining ecological systems, is driven by, and this is where there's a squeeze on Canberra. Victoria, back in 2007, wouldn't refer water powers to the Commonwealth Government. Howard wanted a referral for Canberra to completely take over water. Victoria wouldn't agree for whatever reasons, so we've been left with state laws and the overarching federal law. But to have the Water Act constitutionally valid, it has to have as part of its objects Australia fulfilling its international environmental treaty obligations, and we just won't. With a rubbish basin plan, our critical wetlands, our Ramsar listed wetlands that we have obligations to maintain their condition will start to deteriorate. And then you run into the problem of not just, as Brett found, an unlawful basin plan, but a constitutionally invalid one, because we're not meeting our international treaty obligations. And that's going to be a problem for Canberra.
Yeah, well, we're not meeting them at the moment.
No.
Right? The science is basically saying we're not meeting them. Look, I challenge Richard's view in terms of, you know, handing all the powers to the Commonwealth will solve the problem. Look,
I don't know whether it was a good idea or not, but I'm just saying it didn't happen.
It's just one of those things, I suppose, but a lot of people did, you know, let's get it with one government. And my observation would be, I worked through both sides. I would say that things were very slow under the previous regime. there aren't too many bad decisions that were made. There were an absence of decisions, but there weren't too many bad decisions made, because what it required was consensus between the governments. And if you had one bad one, the others would keep the others, you know, and you had the various electoral cycles and all of that sort of stuff.
It doesn't work like that in water, though.
No.
I mean, Victoria's been terrible for the basin plan, and particularly for the 450. And New South Wales hasn't been great either. The reason Howard said, I want referrals of power, is because I know New South Wales and Victoria will just want to go on with their over-allocating ways. South Australia will be trying to protect the Coorong. Queensland will be wanting to join Victoria and New South Wales in over-allocating the system, and that's why he felt it was best for it to be. Now, whether it would have been or not,
this is where we get
know.
interjurisdictional differences between Victoria and South Australia, and it will play out, right?
Well,
and,
it was inevitable, wasn't it?
Well, once upon a time, when I worked for the Victorian government, I was also seen as a friend of South Australia, right? So
they're not these days, I'll tell you that much.
Look, I think the issue is more that it's about how you divide the powers, and the point I was going to make was, if you put it all in charge of the Commonwealth, right, that means there's only one ministerial door to knock on, and we've all seen what happens with that, right? So there's the lack of, you know, the previous system wasn't perfect. I would argue this one's even more flawed. There's one door to knock on, and we've seen what's happened when a wrong person's put in charge of that particular
I
door.
want to go back to Kate about land management.
Yeah, I definitely think that we still have a great deal more to learn and understand and just adapt as well to, one, like a future with less water, but then also how we are like managing our river systems, because I think we've had a very, you know, when we started how we're sort of managing the rivers, and the Murray is a really good example. A lot of people look at it and go, you know, oh, there's always water in it. What are you whinging about? That's not a healthy river. And I think it comes back to like also our native species and all that type of thing. Locks and weirs are not good for our native species. And so we've got a lot to learn when it comes to land management and also water management, but also understanding as well like how it works. Because I get so many people sort of say to me, they're like, oh, you know, just block off the bottom of it and don't let all that water go out to sea. It's a waste. And yet it's 4 tonnes of salt per minute go out the mouth of the river. So if we block that up, it's like, you know, corking a human up and, you know, keep feeding it. That's what it's going to be like. It's really problematic, and we'll see hundreds of kilometres of rivers die, particularly in the South Australian side of it, and yet that's the common argument, and the whole river will be sick if we do that.
Brendan?
Yes, you put it nicely. I had another way of putting
It was
it.
a hell of an image, wasn't it?
But isn't it funny how you and I have run out of water over here and they still got some over there?
Because we're not used to having it.
How much are you going to give me for it?
To
sell it to you.
the Ngarrindjeri, in the Coorong, they refer to the Coorong as the bowel. So that speaks to exactly what you just said then. You block that up, you block your bowel up. And same with us, we block our veins. So the rivers are our veins and the creeks are our arteries and the wetlands and lagoons are our organs. So if you block that up, you're killing this. Oh, once a time ago there was one system. There weren't jurisdictions.
Yeah. Brendan,
Why am I bringing all the comedy to this talk tonight?
Just a
I'm
funny
supposed to
fella.
be serious and, you know, angry.
yeah, well, yeah, that's all right. We're getting that too.
It's NAIDOC week.
Exactly, it's NAIDOC week.
You're not shaking the spear yet then.
Well, that's why I wanted to actually come back to you, given that it is NAIDOC week. Tell me how. I mean, you know, you may be there may be regard paid to the Indigenous point of view. That's hilarious. That's bitterly funny. But in this NAIDOC week, we're actually talking about elevating voices and access to information, and also listening to Indigenous voices and Indigenous experience. Tell us how that experience would be included in the next plan and should be included. How do you see that operating, if it was to operate well?
Basin Plan 2, well, it's under review at the moment, and now all the jurisdictions are all scrambling around. Let's get out to all the nations, or let's not get out to all the nations and try and let's keep it in-house. I think New South Wales, you know, I won't talk about them. Victoria is making an effort in terms of building up, you know, the First Nations water base and their resourcing and support, even though they are the main instigators in all this problem with the system and the interjurisdictional. There's going to be wars in the future about water. that's what's going to happen in the next 50 years. And is that something we want to leave behind for our descendants, where the states are going to be fighting each other over this system that's going to get drier and drier?
Can I just bring in a really important parallel discussion that's going on in the country at the moment? Could you imagine that a voice to Parliament might actually have a role in talking about this kind of policy and then being listened to?
Well, I would hope so.
Is that how you?
I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist, but I'm also, I'll call stuff out. A voice, I don't know. A treaty, yes.
Right.
I would hope a treaty would. A voice. Any voice. We don't have a voice at the moment, so we do have a number of voices in there, but we don't have a one powerful voice, so maybe that could be a good thing. But certainly a treaty, and is this designed to sort of steer away from a treaty? Because a treaty would have to include land and water as part of it. So
I think what's really important as well is people wanting to listen too. And I always sort of say that I wouldn't be doing the advocacy that I am right now if it wasn't for the Barkindji people and what they've taught me. And, you know, as a fifth generation farmer, the generosity that they have shown me to take me out on country and teach me so much more and understand, you know, listening to the country. And I think that's what our basin plan doesn't do.
Yeah.
And yet it's something that when you go out there, like I've had some of the most magical experiences with elders from out our way. And so part of it is, you know, like non-Aboriginal people wanting to go out and listen to, because if you do, it's changed my life, that's for sure.
now, people want everyone to believe that First Nations people are against the farming communities. That's not true. That's never been true. We've relied on the farming communities to help us survive. So we've been dispossessed. We're not in the business of dispossessing people. But there's a lot of land and water that should be made available for our people.
Yeah. Richard?
I think it's highly likely if, say there was a voice to Parliament of the kind that's being proposed this year, but it had been in place while the Basin Plan was being drafted and the Water Act being drafted, I think they would look different.
Do you?
Yeah.
What do you base that on?
I think if there was a voice to Parliament where there was proper consultation with the Aboriginal nations of the Murray-Darling Basin over the structure of the Water Act and the structure of the Basin Plan, the processes for consultation would have been proper and not tokenistic. That is actual engagement, not just saying we're going to have a meeting in a week, turn up if you want, but actual engagement. And I think there probably, it's not certain, but I think there probably would have been directives for cultural flows within the Basin Plan, that is water specifically allocated to the nations. By cultural flows, probably better that Brendan explains what they are, but they don't just mean spiritual water, but they also mean water for an economic use as well as a spiritual use. But
Cultural
Brendan
economy.
should probably explain that.
Dr. Aaron O'Donnell's written a paper called Cultural Water for Cultural Economies. It was a quote she borrowed from me. But our cultural economy has been just levelled, it's been flattened, it's been not entirely destroyed, but you take the water away from our people, then you're destroying our cultural economy.
So for those who might not know, what's the best way of describing a cultural flow?
Cultural flow, look up the Echuca Declaration. It's water that is of a sufficient quality, and that's determined by the nations themselves and in that Pacific nation, and it's water that meets our cultural, spiritual, social and economic benefits for our people.
And the township
as determined by us.
The township of Wilcannia, which is where like my partner and I, we live between Menindee and Wilcannia now, and that's had research done on it that like Wilcannia is a heartbreaking story. So it used to be about the fourth largest inland port in Australia, which just proves you used to be able to get a riverboat up there, and Uncle Badger Bates now says I can't get a bark canoe down it. So that shows the change. The township of Wilcannia has a male life expectancy of 37 and a female life expectancy of 42. It's in Australia. That is worse than some African countries. That should not be happening in our country. But there's been research that shows that when there's water in the river, the crime rate decreases and life expectancy increases. Like, that's the facts. That's what water brings life, and it does, like, more so to our Aboriginal communities. And because, like, you know, they're Barkindji people. They are river people. That's where they get their name from. And you see it front and centre, and I have seen it in our communities, that it brings life, it brings economic prosperity for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people alike.
I've got a question here I want to ask, and I think we'll come to you first for this one, Michael. Tamara Robson asks, if you ask scientists to judge how much water should be protected for the environment, won't this lead to the science becoming politicised over competing interests for water?
Interesting balance between politics and science, isn't it? Look, I think Wentworth Group comes from this position, you know, and just for those of you who don't understand, we're independent, we're non-partisan, expert-based. So our job is to get the best available science feeding into decision-making and policy-making. And I think, again, look, you know, the nature of science is the job is never done. There will always be disagreement. And politicians don't like that because it means coping with uncertainty. There's no magic answer here, and I think that's just something we've got to get used to. I think one of the great lessons out of COVID, I think, has taught a lot of people about how science works, and I think it's been a great thing.
But it's meant to be transparent, isn't it?
Yeah, and it needs to be transparent. And look, you know, as Wentworth Group, we've actually raised concerns many times. There are a lot of scientists that are on the government payroll, have been for a very long time in the basin. And I don't know whether any of you recall, but there was an ad in the Australian some time ago with a whole lot of people saying, oh, the Murray-Darling Basin plan's really great. But when you went through all the people that signed it off, they'd also been, you know, the beneficiaries of substantial Commonwealth research funding. Now,
they're still to be listened to, aren't they?
Yes, they are, but the question is this science impartial? Right?
Ad in the Australian isn't peer-reviewed science either.
No, but this was a whole-page ad, right, by scientists saying the basin plan's a good thing. Right, it did cause some consternation in amongst the broader science community. Now, look, I'm not disparaging anyone who's there.
It sounds like you are.
No, look, but I think, again...
Certainly sounds like Richard is.
No, it's the independent... I think the importance is the independence, right? And if someone's paying your rent... well, you're not going to tell them bad news, are you? Right? So this goes back to the nature of funding for universities and so on, that if it's tied money for a specific purpose, someone else has actually decided what that research is going to be, not you. Right? They've come to you, it's like a consultant. Yeah, we need to know X, we need to know Y.
So is our questioner Tamara right then? That if you rely on that you enter a politicised field?
Oh, no, look, peer-reviewed science, you know, should, I'm not saying in any way perfect, should reveal that.
Oh, totally agree. And I think some of the problem is that a lot of work on the Murray-Darling Basin plan isn't peer-reviewed. And if you actually look at like some of the propaganda that goes out there sort of thing, you're like, well, can you point me to a peer-reviewed piece of literature? And that, for me, is like a scientist's job, is to be impartial and to tell the facts. And unfortunately, it doesn't always happen.
And Brendan, how do we get Indigenous science into the conversation?
Just ask. Like...
It's not just peer-reviewed, it's not publicly disclosed, which is pretty offensive. So what we tend to get is things that look more like press releases than science. And Australia has a lot of good scientists, but they're unable to actually do the work to work out whether what the Basin Authority has done is legit, because science is open, it's transparent, you can test it, you can prove it right, you can prove it wrong. That is science, and we don't get, it's one of the findings Walker made, there's no science coming out of the MDBA because it's not transparent enough.
Yeah, but you're being a bit absolute about it. I mean, you mentioned the COVID experience. I mean, if the COVID experience showed us anything, actually we don't get that. We do get a very lively debate, and we end up with not a plethora, but a number of very fixed and different views, and you know, slugging it out, and the different scientific lines believing that they are in possession of the greater facts.
Yeah, so it's not hard to say these are the parts of the environment we want to save. This is the ecological response we want. This is the modelling we've done. You have a look at it and see whether we're right.
And look, can I just add to that? You know, science doesn't get away scot-free either, you know, so there's a couple of issues here. Peer-reviewed papers appear in international journals, and you have to pay an arm and a leg, like about $50 or $60 for one paper, right? So the first and foremost question in all of this is public access. And for me, and look, I've got friends and colleagues in the room here, we've been working for quite some time now as scientists with the community, right? Because the community needs access to this science, right? And it needs to be able to challenge it and question it, and therefore it will then build its own knowledge and will build its own trust. And through that, we can learn together. And it's an ongoing process. There's no magic answer, as I say. So, yeah, we're a bit guilty ourselves.
I just want to whip through it. We've got time's running out, but a few questions I did want to get to, just some nuts and bolts that'll be, I think, really informative for you in the next 12 months as we look towards, you know, the review of Plan 1 and towards Plan 2. We need to talk about reconciliation and reconciliation date. First of all, can you take us through what that actually is, Michael, for those who came in late?
Yeah, so there is a process under the Murray-Darling Basin plan where the SID land projects, which are basically engineering projects, get evaluated. And the basis of these projects, I think, as Richard pointed out earlier, was they're not actually about supplying actual water. What they're about is basically engineering and pipes and whatever else, and sometimes rules, that take water to a specific site which otherwise would have difficulty in getting water to it. Right, and particularly like if you look at, you know, hypothetically a wetland somewhere near Mildura, sitting up in the box, you know, up in the top part of the floodplain, to get water to that would be quite difficult. You need a vast volume of water for quite a period of time to get it up and over and into the box country. Okay, that's fine. So we've had a recent case, Haddock-O'Kine, where there's engineering works to take water to the box, and it's pipes and pumps and gates and the like, because otherwise it'd never get watered. And now, the reconciliation process is along the lines of when governments put this up, there was a calculation done, as Richard said, of the environmental equivalence in terms of gigalitres of the benefits of that project. And theoretically, by the 30th of June next year, there should, well, I think it's actually the end of this year, the reconciliation process is supposed to kick off, whereby those projects are put up for review. Problem being...
And to see whether they achieve the outcomes.
Yeah, whether they achieve their outcomes, and there is a model, right, an environmental equivalence model, which is a hypothetical model with no empirical data and, you know, Delphic, you know, views and all sorts of stuff. So, look, it's the best of that, but it's now 10 years old. Yep. Right? And we've raised, the Wentworth Group has raised this particularly with the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and States. This model is 10 years old. It doesn't include the lessons we learnt from Living Murray, where we did a lot of those things, for starters.
Well, I actually wanted to go around the panel, if just briefly, if we can, and just ask you what you think will happen now, between now and the reconciliation date.
The deadlines are going to be extended. So for the 450 gigalitres of water that we've recovered about 4, the deadline will be extended. What happens after that? The deadline has to be extended because they can't meet it. So, but the issue is going to be the contest between Victoria, possibly New South Wales, change of government there, and South Australia and possibly the Commonwealth about how that water is acquired, whether it's through using water more efficiently and paying farmers to do that, which is this very expensive scheme that's being used to recover almost nothing, and in relation to which there are now unlawful but agreed criteria to base on a socio-economic basis, where if one of these projects costs one job, they don't go ahead, or whether, which I think is the only realistic way of that water being recovered, is through voluntary purchases of water for the environment, which will require legislative change in itself. That's, in the end, whether that happens or not depends on how determined Tanya Plibersek is to make it happen. For the 605, the supply measures that Michael was talking about, Brett in his Royal Commission report found they were based on non-transparent science that was closer to pseudoscience. There's no peer-reviewed work that shows these pieces of infrastructure actually equal 605 gigalitres. So I've said to the South Australian government, you should be agitating, not to stop it, because if it can be proved to work, fantastic. Who doesn't want more water for irrigators if less water can get the same environmental outcomes? But there should be an independent inquiry, and look, based on Brett's findings, any government acting with integrity would stand up a scientific inquiry to see whether this is legit, because there's big question marks about it.
I just want to hear from Kate before we go to you, Michael.
Yeah, so Menindee was actually going to be the biggest of these sustainable diversion limit adjustment mechanisms, or 605 gigalitre projects, and it would have destroyed our lakes. It is, like, in Richard's book, he calls it the fish genocide project. That's how bad it was. They essentially just wanted to cut off natural lake systems from out our way, and that would have been devastating for the community, for the traditional owners, for absolutely everything. We know from the Murray-Darling Basin Authority that it'll probably be up to, I reckon at least, but we'll see, up to 315 gigalitres short from that 605. So it's well off track and it's not going to happen, and the two biggest projects have fallen over because of lack of community support, and, you know, even the National Party sort of turned around and said, maybe these aren't that great, because they would have had problems. So we're going to be really short. The issue is, I've heard from experts that have been in this space for a lot of time that there's no hard, you have to recover the water afterwards. It's sort of got left a bit willy-nilly. So really, a lot of it is up to the government of the day overseeing it. And that's kind of what's happened with a lot of the basin. We've seen a decade of inaction on water recovery, and we just sort of keep kicking the ball down the road. That's really problematic.
Brendan?
Well, the said lamb, in my country, on the Victorian side of the Murray, from Swan Hill to Mildura, and then further on to the SA border, there's 57 structures impacts to our country. So some of them are quite large structures, concrete structures, some are small. But we're going to fight like hell to stop this. We don't want any more structures on our country. That's not the footprint we want to leave behind on our watch. The other thing is, and Michael's explained, the rationale is to get water up there. It's not about getting water there, it's about putting in these structures to forever stop water from getting to those places. They want to keep water in the Murray River Channel. They don't want water to get out onto the floodplain, and these will prevent water from getting out there. And they'll decide when and where and if they want to deliver water there, and they'll prioritise. And that's not, for us, that's not how you care for country. This is a water landscape. It's a cultural landscape, and it needs its water. And these SIDLAM projects, for me, it is the final nail in the coffin of our country.
Michael?
Yeah, look, I think Brett's raised a good point. I mean, I just picked one thing up, the 450, I think there's about 26 gigalitres or something, actually. Some of it's promised and some of it's there, but still, you know, nothing near where we need to be. So effectively, to meet the target by 30th of June next year, I think Andrew McConville was pretty honest about it last November. He said about 700 gigalitres. Now, it's all very well to talk about going to the market and buying that from willing purchasers, but it's not out there. I suspect a lot of Tanya Plibersek's comments recently this week are adorning, that says, look, the market's not going to deliver that quantity of water. So it really does become a really big question. How do we recover that water? And what the hell's the impact going to be, even if we did try and buy it in the market? And it's such a large volume that, look, again, it poses a whole series of other questions. So,
well, look, if I can, and I know it's unfair to ask you to be brief about this, but I think we'll just finish on that observation. What then do you see as the options for recovering the 450? And do you see it as being feasible in the next 12 to 24 months? I'll start with you, Kate, if I can.
It's not going to happen in the next 12 months. And it's interesting, the language from this government saying, oh, we didn't realise what a mess we were coming into. We all knew what a mess the Murray-Darling Basin plan has been. We're not going to get it on time. The reality is, though, the cheapest and most efficient way is to recover through buybacks. Efficiency projects, there's been serious questions about the integrity of a lot of them, whether they're recovering the water, and I think the review will show us a lot. The simple fact is we need to recover this water, and we've said it a number of times, the basin plan was a compromise, and we cannot keep asking the basin and the environment to compromise further.
Richard?
I'm not against a combination of buying and efficiency projects, provided the efficiency projects stack up and have integrity and do deliver the water. If we are going to buy water, and that, I mean, no one's ever explained to me why Australians that own water can't actually sell it to their government for environmental purposes, but leaving that moral or ethical issue aside, if the purchase of water in a particular area of Australia does cause harm, then I do think that coinciding with that, there has to be investment in those communities to compensate for that.
Yeah. Michael?
Yeah, look, Wentworth Group just put a submission up to the recent Commonwealth request for good ideas, and it comes back to one we put up in 2010, which is all options should be open, but do it with communities. And, you know, 700 GL on the market, you're just not going to do it. I mean, the market isn't large enough, regardless of whether you wanted to or not. And so it really has to be looked at again at a community level and saying, okay, maybe there are some communities that want to move from irrigated agriculture to other things. Maybe there are some other communities that want to diversify their economies and not be so reliant on water. And the pros and cons, or the benefits and the costs, don't necessarily need to be in the same place, right? Because at the end of the day, it's the whole basin, you know, that's doing a big job for the country. We made the mistake of over-allocating it, to a degree out of ignorance, to a degree out of greed. These people aren't personally responsible for this. So, and I think we need to come back. And just finally, the National Water Initiative, since about whenever I knew about it, but 90s, talked about structural adjustment. And yet, as far as I'm aware, not $1 has been spent on structural adjustment. We've done it for car industries, we've done it for the dairy industry, we've done it for that. Now, if there's ever been a place where we need structural adjustment, because we need to transition from one thing to another, it's no fault of the people on the ground, then structural adjustment needs to be on the table. And governments need to say, if you want to move, here are your options in terms of funding, community development and the like. And look, I think it really is time to put it back to the community and say, okay, we need this. Let's stop arguing about the quantum. Let's start talking about how we do it.
I want to finish on Brendan's observation for getting the 450 back.
Just thinking about this, and to return water back to the environment, I mean, that can't be a bad thing. But even to be thinking about we're in a situation where we have to retrieve and return water back to the environment, that's quite crazy. Really, that shows you how sick a system, not the environment, that's been created, that we've now have to justify returning water to Mother Earth, to the environment. That's quite strange.
Yeah. I think, Brendan, you should listen to the audio of David Littleproud on Radio National yesterday morning, where he's talking about this new technology called a dam, that he thinks that a smart country would be investing in a whole lot more.
Has it got a metre on it?
It's been wonderful you came out tonight. Please thank our terrific panel, Richard Beasley, Kate McBride, Brendan Kennedy and Michael Van Der Zee as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So I'll just finish on one note. There was a question up there about what can everyday Australians do to help this whole situation. So it's got many of us thinking about what's next and what's the pathway forward. Well, the next MINCO, as we've talked about, will be arguably the most critical in the whole of the Murray-Darling Basin plan, and it's going to be a crucial time for ministers to step up and deliver what's needed. So up on screen right now is a QR code, and this is a simple but powerful way that you can help. So if you can get your phones out and scan the code now, there's a template where you can send a message to the National Environment Minister, Tanya Plibersek, and let her know exactly that you care about the river and specifically about the points that we've discussed tonight. That'll be really crucial. So this has been a collaborative effort from conservation councils across the country, and it's going to take all of us kind of working together and being really loud and vocal. So finally, to the panel and to our wonderful MC, thank you so much for your advocacy and your generosity in this space. It's incredibly appreciated and so important. I've got a small gift which I will give you in a moment, and I'm so sorry to the panel. I've been to Hague's every single time and I can't get them chocolate covered almonds, obviously. So we've gone for a collaboration by an Aboriginal owned company, Wandu, and the flavour is river mint, so I hope you enjoy. Thank you so much. It's amazing.